And nearly every slave revolt in the United States was betrayed by house servants. Now, if you got your West Indian nationalism or your negative Afro-American feeling up, you have immediately arrived at the wrong conclusion. Both of us were victims of a historical experience over which we had no control. Fortunately for the West Indies, they didn't break him up enough to destroy his loyalty systems. Now, there are exceptions. There are numbers of revolts in the West Indies betrayed by house servants, but generally, the house servant was the motivator of the revolt. One of the classical cases was the revolt in the Danish West Indies, finally led by a black woman who called herself Queen Mary. She was the mistress of the governor, and the rebels told her that at a certain time they were going to invade the house, cut the governor's throat, and burn the house down over his head. And she said, "What kind of loyal African do you take me to be? You are telling me just to get out of the house. I am for the revolution, and I understand what I will have to lose." She will have to lose her carriage, which she had, those long, beautiful white dresses imported from Europe that she had, and that set of umbrellas that she had with somebody to carry them over her head. She said, inasmuch as I have to leave the house at a certain time, why would you send a man all the way to the house to cut the governor's throat? I would do that before I leave. Now, in spite of the luxury that she had being the mistress of the governor, she had no illusion where her loyalty had to be when the deal went down. And she knew that it was time now for the deal to go down. Now, the same thing happened in Brazil among the black women married to Portuguese men, only they maneuvered in a different way, always marrying off one of her relatives to a Portuguese man newly arrived in the colonies, and making these women swear that they would marry unless marriage meant automatic freedom. And when the Portuguese decided to push into the hinterlands of Brazil, these women convinced the Portuguese that you have no armies up there to protect you or to hold any slaves intact. We might as well free some men to go up and do this labor and pay them some decent salaries. These women laid the foundation for the civilization of Brazil. Some of the first families in the New World were families born from the cohabitation of the slave master and these African women. My main point here is that these African women never lost their sense of commitment to African people. And one of the main reasons why they did not lose their sense of commitment to African people is the fact that their cultural continuity had not been broken. Now, in the 1780s, some of this kind of feeling and spirit began to develop in the United States once the blacks, especially in New England, where you had a large number of black craftsmen who freed themselves by virtue of their craftsmanship. They could create a kind of money over and above that was due their master and buy their own freedom. These black craftsmen, having learned how to read, became conscious of their people's plight and began to develop newspapers, magazines, and journals, and became a part of the abolitionist movement. Once they developed newspapers and journals, they began once more to search for their definition. Then in 1829, a black man who ran a second-hand store named David Walker began to look at the situation and make an assessment of what black people had to do, and issued his famous appeal to the colored people of the world. This appeal was the first theoretical basis of what you call Pan-Africanism, and it was the first call for genuine, raw, unmitigated black power. It was the first rejection of the concept that any people could free themselves without violence. And it was rejection of the imagery and the concept that was laid down for black people. Douglass had some serious questions about it, but out of this spirit and out of this period, a number of journals would be developed. Freedom's Journal, North Star, Douglass's newspaper, and a brilliant Jamaican that a lot of Jamaicans don't know was a Jamaican, John B. Russwam, one of the early black college graduates, would edit Freedom's Journal. He would join the colonization movement in spite of his questions about it, and he would go later to Liberia as governor of one of the colonies. The African awareness now was running rampant among black Americans. Martin Delaney would go out to what is now Nigeria with another Jamaican, Robert Campbell, author of an excellent work called Pilgrimage to My Motherland. My point here is that Caribbean Americans coming to the United States at the time did not see their plight as different from that of black Americans. Prince Hall from Barbados had found the Masons, the black Masons. Peter Ogden from Antigua had found the black Oddfellows and was beginning to use these large oriented organizations as form of protest movements. This was the beginning of the formalization of the black intellectual freedom movement. And during this period, we produced some of the most responsible intellects this country has ever known, and also produced a radical class who excelled any other radicals in the country. But the search for African definition would continue after the Civil War, and it would be reflected in the works of Bishop Turner, a Ghanaian named Chief Sam, who promised to take all black Americans back to Africa. These are the 1880s now. Bishop Turner would last until 1915, when he died, the same year Booker Washington died. Near the end of the century, the whites grew tired of dealing with multiplicities of black leaders, and then they decided that they would create a leader. And after the creation of this leader, the first anointed black leader in America, created by white editorial writers, and white editorial writers have been creating nearly every black leader since then, and those they do not create, they eventually either kill, drive into exile, or drive to suicide. Now, at the end of the 19th century, there was a man who had made a great impression on the white people. His name was Booker T. Washington, and we need to look at Booker T. Washington and look at him anew. Now, if you call him an Uncle Tom, you've never been so wrong in your life. He's bigger than that. And in his Atlanta Compromise speech, when you look at the historical background which led him to this speech in 1895, the speech was all things to all people. One of the most unique speeches ever made in the history of the world. And you should read it, almost read it yearly, and analyze it. What in the hell was he talking about? There was something in it for the South, telling the South you need not worry. Something in it for blacks, telling the blacks you got good white people here who will take care of you, look after you, be skilled artisans. Something in it for the Northerner who owned the South then and now, telling him that there is peaceful labor here in the South who will not start strikes like those immigrant ingrates up north. The tone of the speech was partly anti-foreign. And he knew exactly that it would get across in this setting. He was telling blacks, he attacked the black politician, said stump speeching is not what's going to get it for us. Better open a dairy farm.